Nearly there. Okay, we should be going live on Facebook now as well. Preparing the live stream. It's just loading. Oh, it might not do it. Okay, so as Kirsty's just said, this is our pollination webinar, specifically looking at zero hunger. So let's begin. So this is just a little overview of what we're going to do today. So we'll start with just some basics about pollination, some of the impacts on food that we eat. Then we'll talk with our guest speakers about some other impacts as well. We'll end with a little question and answer session as well. So feel free to share any questions in the chat as well. So to begin with, we'll talk about what pollination actually is. So this is a process of fertilizing a flower. There are many kinds of pollinators, one of which is the bee that we can see in the picture. I was wondering if anyone would like to share in chat any other pollinators that you know. Don't worry about being wrong. This is a learning opportunity. But I'll give you 30 seconds in the chat. We found out earlier that there are some animals that we wouldn't expect to be pollinators, such as elephants in Indonesia. They do a process called heliophily, where they pollinate a flower. So there's many different animals that you wouldn't expect to be pollinators, but they are. But feel free to add any more pollinators that you know in the chat. I'll give you a little time to say some. Yep, so we've got some in the chat there now. Flies, butterflies, birds, they're all really good pollinators, really common in the UK as well, specifically. Yeah, we do have some frogs. Frogs pollinate in South America. They've recently been found to be pollinators in South America. That was a very interesting one. That's one that you wouldn't quite expect, quite different from the norm of what you would expect a pollinator to be. So I've just prepared a little animation as well, just to sort of show what pollination is, again, specifically looking at how a bee pollinates, as that is what most people tend to think of when they think of pollinators. So here we've got a little bumblebee, and the bee gets really hungry, and the food that the bees eat is nectar. Nectar is found in the stamen of the flower, so it's right in the centre. So the bee has to go right in to get it, and as it does, it's got pollen baskets which fill up with the pollen. One flower is not enough for a bee to keep full. It wants to have a bit more nectar. So it moves over to another flower and it drinks the nectar from there. And as it does, the pollen from the first flower transfers over to that one. And this is called cross-pollination. And by doing this, this means that seeds and fruits can be formed so that the flowers and the plants can keep growing, keep surviving, and the species can just continue. So now we've just got a few facts about food and how pollinators affect this. So pollinators affect 35% of food production, which is about 1 in every 3 mouthfuls of food. If you would like to share any foods that you think are solely reliant on pollinators or heavily reliant on pollinators, feel free. Rachel and Richard, I don't know if you've got any foods that you think are quite heavily influenced by pollinators that you want to share.
Yeah, there's lots of things like fruit crops, so apples, things like tomatoes, raspberries, strawberries. I'm sure I've got a few in my talk.
Yeah. Oh yeah, so in the chat we've got figs, that's a good one. They're pollinated by wasps. They go inside the actual the flower is on the inside of the fruit. We got maize. Maize is pollinated by some insects, but it's also wind pollinated as well. I think that's the main pollination of that plant. Yes, potatoes, that is a big one. Potatoes are pollinated by insects as well. So the pollinators, as well as fertilizing these flowers, they actually increase the nutritional value of the foods as well sometimes. So it's sort of a win-win. The flower can keep growing, but also the foods that it produces will have better nutritional value. And so thinking about that, we've got a plate of food here. We've got potatoes, vegetables, and chicken. So with what we've just said, what do you think would be sort of solely impacted by pollinators, like directly impacted? So I'll just give it a few seconds for the chat. Yeah, so there's actually all of this plate is impacted by pollinators. So if we think by a direct impact, then the peas, the potatoes, the vegetables, that will all be directly impacted because these are all pollinated by insects. But there's more to it than that. So if we think about a food web, this shows the connection between all the different animals, plants, where all the energy sources go. And if we just look at this diagram, you can see that bees can pollinate tomatoes. We eat tomatoes, and if the population of bees decreases, then we will, in very simplistic terms, have less tomatoes to eat. And then if we follow that on, you can see that rabbits also eat tomatoes, and then it shows that bears eat rabbits. If we have less bees, there will be less tomatoes. This will mean that rabbits have less tomatoes to eat, and then that might decrease their population, and then the bears will have less rabbits to eat, and it goes on like that. So you can see how everything is dependent on each other. Thankfully, there are other sources of food for these animals, but if everything sort of starts decreasing, then you can see how it can have knock-on effects. So if we go back to our plate of food, we'll be able to see that actually the whole plate can become affected. For example, in the chicken grain, which is used to feed the chickens, it's got maize and cereals in it, which are wind pollinated, but it is also it's got a lot of soya bean in and lots of edible herbs, which are all pollinated by insects. By a reduction in this, we might end up with a reduction in chicken, and then this whole plate is affected. You can really see the sort of detrimental impacts that pollinators can have if they're lost. And so thinking about that, this is just a little overview of our Sustainable Development Goals, which were set out by the UN. And there are 17 in total. Just like the food webs, these are all interconnected, as we'll see a bit later in the presentation. So just for example, we're looking at zero hunger. If we are able to increase the crops that we produce, then this will also help with SDG number 8, which is decent work and economic growth, because it will produce more work opportunities for people. They'll then get more money. And then that will then in turn link to other SDGs such as number 3, good health and well-being. They'll have more money to pay for more healthcare. And so you can see here, just like a food web, these are all interconnected as well. As I said, we are specifically looking at SDG number 2, zero hunger. These are the specific objectives for SDG 2. So we've got increased productivity and production, help maintain ecosystems, and strengthen capacity for adaptation to climate change, extreme weather, drought, flooding, and other disasters. So if we work together to strengthen the capacity for food crops so that they can adapt to climate change, this will in turn help to increase the pollinator numbers. They'll have more supplies of food and nectar and plants to pollinate. This then has a reciprocal effect of increasing the productivity and production of the crops, and it also helps to maintain the ecosystem. These objectives are all related to each other, and if we can help increase one, then they will all increase, and they all work together to just increase pollinator numbers, increase our food supply. It's all a connected system. And so I would just like now to introduce our first guest speaker. So this is Rachel Richards from Buglife. She's going to give a short presentation on what Buglife do, as well as a specific project that she's working on, which is beelines. So if you're ready, Rachel, then you can take over. I'll just end the presentation.
Stop making noise, please. Okay, 1 second. Okay, can you see that all right?
Yeah, we can see that good.
Okay. Hi, good morning. I'm Rachel Richards. I work for a charity called Buglife, and we look after the little things that look after the planet. So the invertebrates, things without backbones. So we're going to talk about pollinators and beelines this morning. So what's the value of invertebrates initially? So obviously they have their own individual value, just like people, but they also help us to look after habitats through pollination that we're going to be talking about a little bit more in a minute. Something called integrated pest management, which is when predatory insects eat other insects, so things like ladybirds eating aphids. So they help to control things that could become crop pests. They're also food for other wildlife. They're at the base of the food chain, so they're very important. And they even do things like keeping soils healthy. So you think about worms making their burrows, aerating the soil, letting the water flow through so there isn't flooding, but also things like dung beetles that are eating into the dung and pulling it down underground to feed their larvae. If they weren't there, you'd have piles of dung everywhere in the countryside. There's so many other things that invertebrates are doing, but that's just some of them. So pollination, you've already had some of these stats from Emily. So 8 out of 10 wild plants need insect pollinators. And 1 in 3 mouthfuls of our food depend on pollination, not just insects, but like you've said, things like birds and mammals. You think of fruit bats, there's a lot of animals that contribute to pollination. And 84% of our EU crops rely on insect pollination. So that's worth a lot of money. In the UK, that's 690 million a year. And like we were saying, wild pollinators, so we actually have a diversity of different pollinating insects. I'll look at those in a minute. So having lots of different types of pollinators helps to increase the yield. That means you're producing more crops, but also the quality of that crop. So whether it's big and flavoursome. So this is in the UK, in Britain. We have at least 4,000 species involved in pollination. So people tend to think mostly of the honeybee. The honeybee is a domestic species in most places. So a bit like you're having chickens in your gardens, people look after honeybees. There are some wild ones that will nest in trees, but generally we're taking care of them. We're taking honey from them that they're producing and giving them something else back to eat. But we have all these wild pollinators in the UK as well. So we have about 25 species of bumblebee. In the world, there are 250 species of bumblebee. In the UK, we have 250 species of solitary bee. Some of those are just 4 millimeters, just tiny little things that you wouldn't even think was a bee. Some of them are stripy and black and yellow. They look like wasps. They're called cuckoo bees, and they lay their eggs in the nests of other bees. And some of the solitary bees are actually quite big and look like bumblebees. And those different sizes of bees means they can get into different sized flowers. And some of them are adapted to particular plants. And bees are quite messy pollinators. You see that solitary bee there? It's covered in in pollen. It's collecting the pollen to take back to its nest to feed its eggs, so that the larvae feed on it as they grow. But because it's quite messy, as it moves between flowers, it transfers some of that pollen, so they make great pollinators. Not just bees though, flies. So you've got a hoverfly there at the top, and we have around 270 species of hoverfly. Now, hoverflies might not carry a lot of pollen, but hoverflies and other flies are very messy. You often see them on flowers covered in pollen. They're not carrying a big pollen load for their young, they're just eating it themselves. But if you watch a patch of flowers, you will generally see lots of flies and maybe just a few bees. So they might only be transferring a few pollen grains here and there, but there's so many flies visiting, they're actually very important pollinators. And things like cocoa is actually pollinated by a little midge. There's a lot of plants that are pollinated by flies, orchids, all sorts of things. We have around 4,000 species of beetle in the UK. Lots of beetles are pollinators. Butterflies don't carry a lot of pollen, but they are pollinators. They are visiting. And obviously all the moths, all the thousands of moth species that we have. But what's happening, unfortunately, is we have a decline in insect pollinators. We are getting less and less of them because of a number of things that we'll look at in a minute. So in a recent study, 2/3 of the pollinating insects in the UK were found to be declining, which is a shame. And our Bugs Matter campaign, it's a citizen science project. There's a little app you can get and record your journeys. It looks at the windscreen splatter phenomenon. So when I was younger in the summer, if you go for a drive, you get insects splattered all over your windscreen. That doesn't happen so much at the moment because the abundance, that's the amount of insects, is also declining in a lot of places. And we found a 64% decline in the last 14 years. No, how many years? 18. 80% of butterfly species are also being found to be in decline. And then we've lost 20 bee and wasp species as well in the last century. So these are worrying numbers. Not everything is declining. There are species that are doing better, particularly those that like the warm climate in Britain. They're moving north with climate change. There are some species that are doing very well. But why is this happening? What's the problem? So we've lost a lot of our flower-rich habitats in the UK and in other countries. So agriculture has become more intensive. After the war, we told the farmers we need to produce more food. We said, take out the hedgerows, make the fields bigger, bigger tractors, we use more chemicals, and we lost a lot of those wildflower meadows and flowery hedgerows, the important habitats for pollinators. And those chemicals as well, we're trying to encourage people to use less and less chemicals. The pesticides and the herbicides are a big problem. Plus, we don't really want them in our food. So organic, when you can, like Richard is doing with his bees, is better. And we have little bits of good habitat scattered through the landscape in many places. And also things like public green space. So this is a park in Wales. You might look at this and understand it's short because people want to play football and other games, but there's no need for the whole area to be short. You could have lovely long, sorry, my dog. You could have lovely long flowery areas around the edges as well, couldn't you? And it would still be beautiful. 1 minute. Sorry, my husband's just taking the dog out of the room. Okay, so we could manage those spaces better. We could have short areas for ball games, but also have long flowery areas for the wildlife. Second, moving on. There we go. So we need more, bigger, better, and more connected areas for wildlife. That's what was decided in the Making Space for Nature report in 2010. This is not working. Okay. 1 sec. There's a little video here.
We all see wildflowers as beautiful and great for our well-being, but for the thousands of pollinating insects that share this land with us, wildflowers are vital. But there's a problem. Pollinators are finding themselves in isolated oases, walled in by agricultural land, urban landscapes, roads and gardens. What humans see as neat and tidy, insects see as desert. Since 1940, we've lost 97% of our flower-rich meadows, and hundreds of our pollinator species are in decline. At Buglife, we have come up with a beautiful solution to the problem: bee lines, a network of insect pathways along which we are restoring and creating wildflower-rich habitat. These insect superhighways will extend across the whole of the UK, allowing wildlife to move freely through our countryside and towns. But we need your help to make it happen. Restoring fields of wildflowers. Making space for wildlife in our towns, on road verges, local parks or gardens. Mowing the lawn less often, it's the easiest thing you can do for your local pollinators. Or how about planting a wildflower meadow in your local park or school? Then add your project to the Beelines map. Help us make our network of habitats bigger, better and more joined up. Find out more at buglife.org.uk. Saving the small things that run the planet.
Okay, so beelines is a solution to this fragmented habitat situation we have in many places. We want to make the landscapes better for pollinators. We want more permanent, connected, flower-rich habitats. So not areas of grass that are cut really short and never allowed to flower. We want these long flowery areas with lots of different plants all through the year. So there's flowers in the spring, all through the summer and into the autumn as well. So a lot of small insects, a lot of the little solitary bees, for example, only a few millimeters long, they don't travel very far. Once they've made a hole, they go out to collect pollen and they're bringing it back and they're only traveling maybe 200, 300, 400 meters. So if you have a lovely little area here and the next place is 5 miles away and something happens to that site, perhaps there's a fire, it starts to recover afterwards, but how do those species get back there if the nearest place for them to recolonize is 5 kilometers away? So we want stepping stones of habitat so the insects, the small insects, can move through the landscape. So beelines is a 3-kilometer corridor that's been mapped across the whole of the UK. So in each county, there's a north-south and an east-west corridor. That 3-kilometer wide corridor isn't solid habitat because there's farmland and roads and all sorts of things there, but we want stepping stones of habitat within that corridor, aiming to fill about 10% of the beelines corridor. And of course, it's not just for pollinators, it's for all wildlife. So we focus on the pollinators, but if we're looking after the habitat for pollinators, we're looking after the habitat in general. We're providing food for the reptiles and the birds and the mammals and everything else as well that needs the same habitat. So this is the beelines map in the UK, and they actually have buzzlines in Europe now as well, which has come off the back of the idea of beelines. And this is a shared map, it's not ours, but it's on our website, but it's been mapped using lots of different individuals and organizations and experts and local people that know the area. And this map can be used by local government, businesses, industries, schools, landowners, anyone really can get involved. This is some of the work that we've done with schools, just a little example. Things like green roofs in built-up area where there isn't a lot of green space, you can put that green space on a roof or on a bus shelter. Putting in a pollinator garden that's got lots of herbs and those sorts of flowers that pollinators love. Having your green space, your the lawn area, letting it flower, letting the buttercups and the daisies and the clovers and things flower, so don't cut it too regularly. Having little wildflower areas as well and leaving them long all summer. Then at the end of the summer, you do a cut and a lift. It's very important to take those cuttings off so you keep the nutrients low, which is good for the wildflowers, so they keep coming back each year. But there's lots of little things you can do, putting in bee hotels as well, and that activity helps to teach other people what they can do and what they can do back home or on their land. So if you do things like this, you can then put it onto the beelines map. That's on our website. It's interactive. You can zoom in, just click on that add site button there at the top when you've found your area, and a little form comes up and you can fill out what you've done, what you've created, be it a wildlife friendly pond or a mini meadow, or you've got fruit trees. Orchards are very good as well, and hedgerows. So do please have a look and add what you're doing in your green spaces onto the map. And that's me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was so interesting. It's really good to see sort of what we can do to help with the problem. And it's really interesting that it's expanded like beyond the UK as well through Europe, you said, with the buzz lines. I was just interested to ask, how did you start your journey in pollinators? How did you sort of begin working with pollinators? Was it something you was always interested in, or did you sort of fall into it?
I've always been interested in wildlife, so I think I started looking at birds and looking at plants, and I think I thought, oh, there's too many insects. I don't know where to start trying to learn insects. But
Yeah.
it was another charity who were doing bumblebee walks, and they wanted volunteers. And they said, well, we'll teach you how to identify them. So I started volunteering with them, and they taught me how to identify bumblebees. And then I started looking at solitary bees and hoverflies. And I think if you do it a little bit at a time, you can get into different groups. I think if
Yeah.
you look at all of it, you think there's way too many. I don't know how I could ever start. But if you choose a group that's interesting to you, be it plants or be it beetles or, whatever you love, and focus on that group for a little while.
Oh,
And
that's really interesting. And so you touched a little bit on sort of the wider impact as well. I was just wondering if you could explain a bit more about how supporting pollinators helps other species and sort of how conserving pollinators can help with biodiversity protection in general as well.
yeah, so you think about our birds, for example. I think in the UK, people know a lot more about birds. A lot of people feed them in their garden and they love birds. Those birds need insects. And even things like great tits that are eating peanuts in your garden, when they have their young need nice soft caterpillars and things. They're not going to give a hard seed to the young. So many birds feed on insects, or at least their young feed on insects. But you think of the swallows and the swifts and the warblers and all these migratory birds, and things like cuckoos that have declined in a lot of places. They're migrating right across the world and coming back to where they're nesting, and they need big fat caterpillars to feed their young. So looking after those insects, many of which are pollinators, helps to look after the ecosystem in general, plus they're food for so many other creatures. And allowing them to pollinate those natural ecosystems, the grassland, the heathlands, woodland even. A lot of trees are wind pollinated. You think of willows, they evolved to be wind pollinated, but they're also visited by a lot of insects, which are also helping with the pollination. So all of those ecosystems, the plants keep growing because they're pollinated.
Yeah, so they're all sort of interconnected with each
Yeah.
other. They all rely on each other as well.
Mm.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that. That's really interesting. We'll come back with a few more questions at the end, if that's okay.
Yeah.
And so now I'd just like to invite Richard to talk about his presentation as well. Richard is the CEO of Niue Honey, which is in New Zealand. So if you want to take it away, Richard.
Hello, everybody. I'm Richard Duncan, and I'm the CEO of Niue Honey Company, but we are based in Niue, in the Pacific island of Niue. I'm based in New Zealand because I have to do all the marketing and those sorts of functions, but our beekeeping operations have been in Niue and have been there since 1999. So I've got a little presentation here. I'll share the screen and I'll just tell you a bit about what we're doing. And incredible to hear what you're doing up there, Rachel, just amazing work. So we're only doing a little bit. We're only working just with the bee, and in the Pacific. But yeah, I'll tell you a bit about that. Let me just share my screen. Is that working?
Not quite at the
Oh,
moment.
hang on, I'll push the share button will help, eh?
Oh, yeah, perfect. We can see it now.
How's that? Yep.
Yeah, all working, all good.
Great. Okay. So this is where Niue is. Sorry about the fuzzy map, but you can see in blue right there in the middle. That's where Niue is. It's about 3-hour flight from Auckland, and yeah, it's a solitary island between the Fiji and Tonga and the Cook Islands, and it's the largest raised coral atoll in the world. And so it's I think quite a big island, 160 square kilometers, and yeah, so that's where we are. Now, Niue Honey Company's been there since 1999. I've been involved for about the last 10 years. And really, we've got two things that are happening on the island. One is the business side of things through the Niue Honey, which I'll show you later. which is developing honey bee products, honey propolis for sale. And that's done in a social enterprise model to raise funds for what really got me connected with this project, which is the bee sanctuary side. And as I won't go into too much detail because previous speakers have covered it wonderfully, the issues with pollinators that the world is facing at the moment. And although we don't have colony collapse disorder down in our hemisphere, our part of the world, there still are some threats to the bees, particularly in New Zealand, and that comes from the spread of diseases, the lack of forage, urbanization, use of chemicals and pesticides, all the sorts of things that you can't just fix overnight. You have to, so it has to be a bit of an integrated approach, like we've heard some of what's happening up in your part of the world, up in the Northern Hemisphere. So this is kind of true for the Pacific, and to some degree, though not colony collapse disorder, threats. And thankfully, what Niue had was most of the Pacific Islands got some bee stock, European honeybees, probably 100, 150 years ago, through missionaries brought them up and they started them going as livelihoods projects. And Niue got a subspecies of European honeybee called the Italian honeybee, which is the Apis mellifera ligustica. And that's the one you can see here on the photo. And it's a yellow bee, and it's a very calm bee. And it's one of the main ones, the main subspecies that's at the a cornerstone of beekeeping internationally. It has a very calm temperament. And as it happens, that's very important for our project in the Pacific, where a lot of the other Pacific Islands, so they have retained clean bee stock because of the isolation, have got a more aggressive bee stock. And so it's been hard to get a livelihood, to get apiculture, a livelihood started in those islands. It's not fun to be hammered by bees in some of these close-knit Pacific Island communities where they live very close to where maybe the apiary yard will be. And so what Niue has is we call it for the region anyway, the last significant and sufficiently isolated stock of healthy, pure Italian honeybees. And that's healthy from a disease profile, but also from a chemical one as well. So that's you can see the picture of the island there, and that's those little yellow rings are our apiary sites. We've got about 2,500 hives spread out across the island like that. And the island could probably take about 8,000 hives, but we're sticking with 2,500 hives. And really, these are the stock that we're using to develop our honey and our honey sales, but also to develop our exports of honeybees to other Pacific Islands. So what's happened really when I first started 10 years ago was to really isolate that island from a biosecurity point of view, so that we made sure there was no other diseases, other bee products or bees that would come onto that island and spread disease into that bee stock. Really, we had a view because it was so isolated and it was a significant stock, that we wanted to protect that for future generations. And so that was the real big plan. And that's where we started. But over the last few years, it's kind of grown to more of a Pacific regional project. And other islands have come on board, and other regional agencies have come on board to get that bee stock to other islands and to reboot beekeeping in the Pacific, basically. And as we've heard from the other speakers, it's really, yes, it's about livelihoods and it's about the honey production in that context, but it's even more essentially about food security and agricultural productivity through planned pollination. And that's certainly what we do as part of our agricultural system in New Zealand. But the islands haven't necessarily had an opportunity for that. And they also have got, limited land. And so you've got limited land, you maximum productivity. And so that's been how the project has evolved over the last few years. We would never necessarily be that bee stock to New Zealand or Australia, certainly because they don't have colony collapse disorder. But it's an insurance policy. For example, the US market, which relies, because they're committed to an industrial agricultural process. They go through bees very quickly, and then they ship them around the country. They'll do the almond pollinations in California, then off to the blueberries and off to the citrus. And so it's very much an industrial practice that is very hard on honeybees. And with colony collapse disorder also there, they have to restock their bees by importing stock out of New Zealand, which they do every year. So now for New Zealand or Australia, where would they go for more bee stock if they needed it? They can only go to some place like the islands, which has cleaner, it has to be at least as clean, but in this case, the islands have cleaner bee stock. That's our little honey house there. When they first found that was completely overgrown by the jungle. So we had to be hacked out of the jungle with a bush knife and in through the back door because it hadn't been run for 20 years. And so my business partner, who is the beekeeper there, who's up there now, he hacked his way in, got through the door, opened the door, and the tools were all still laid out. It was like the previous owners had just gone off to lunch and never come back. All the tools were laid out. So that's our little humble bee honey house. So yeah, this is the stages we're at now. So we've done the local. So we've worked very closely with the Niuean government so we don't have to put a biosecurity measures in place sufficient for a bee sanctuary. So that would be things like not allowing any imports of honey and certainly not any bees, because honey products can potentially carry some bee diseases. So we keep all those out. And because there's no honey allowed into the island, we gift honey to local inhabitants, free, so they can use. So we supply honey free on island as a thank you for their sacrifice of not importing it. So we've got to that stage. And we're just now at the stage of between the local and the regional, where we've been working with some partners internationally, particularly the WTO and some of their partners have been helping us to get it to a regional level. And that entails, we're just about to start a survey. So this month, a survey has started in the Pacific Islands, which goes around and asks a lot of questions around, what's the bee stock like? What's the disease profile? Are there any beekeepers already? Is there an appetite for beekeeping? Does the community want to have beekeeping there? What's the government policy framework, legislatively, biosecurity related? All those sorts of things are factored into a holistic sort of snapshot of where the different islands are at. And then from that process, it develops really a roadmap where we can start with the regional spread of those honeybees. So if you can imagine, Niue would be the hub and the other islands would be the spokes for moving bee stock to those other islands. And as well as, the bee stock, getting the right, so this is the calm Italian honeybee, which is clean. Getting that stock there. There's also a whole lot of teaching that has to happen around best practice in beekeeping, how to set up your hives for Pacific Island beekeeping, which is a tropical climate. So it's a bit different from what would happen typically in New Zealand or perhaps UK in terms of more temperate climates. It's managed differently. For example, we get in New Zealand or in temperate climates, you have typically what they call a honey flow in the spring, and that's your time for harvesting. And from the harvest, then for the rest of the year, the bees will remain dormant, but the beekeepers would feed them sugar. And that's typically how they replace the nectar. The honey's taken, which is nectar source. Thankfully, in Niue and in the Pacific and in many of the tropical places, there's a nectar source year round. And it just becomes a matter of, certainly in Niue, it just has to stop raining for a couple of days. And then something in the forest will flower and the bees will go off. And so you don't get a huge seasonal honey flow, but you get a regular, smaller, flow the whole year round. And that's great too, because we also don't have to feed sugar to our bees, which is, it's not always the best. It's a bit like, having McDonald's every day. It's great for once or twice, but after a while, it's not necessarily so good. And it also can get into the sugar as well, and it get passed on to us as consumers. So that's where we are between the local and the regional. And hopefully in 6 months' time, when this regional survey is finished, then we'll have a roadmap and we'll start the spread of the clean bee stock to the region. And it's really important to make this sustainable. I mean, what's happened typically in some of the islands is, I'll give an example. One of the islands has wanted to calm their bee stock down. They've had an aggressive strain and they wanted to get into beekeeping. So they came to New Zealand and took some queen bees up, probably under the radar. And now there's varroa mites, which is a terrible parasitic mite on a honeybee, which is a vector for a lot of disease and one of the main contributors to the problems we're having internationally with the raised mortality rate in bee stock. That has happened. So we've wanted very much to make sure that doesn't spread, and that spreads by, the best way to do that is to get beekeepers involved, get them the appropriate bee stock from a clean source like Niue, but also when they've got this calm bee stock that's workable and they can create a sustainable business out of it, then they have typically, they've got skin in the game. So they will lobby their governments to say, hey, we need increased biosecurity. We need to keep an eye on what's coming over through the ports, any swarms, any disease. So that creates a bit of a virtuous circle from, they've got a livelihood out of it. So they start to get actively involved in protecting those pollinators. And so that's the kind of the message we're trying to give as well. Not just bee stock, not just beekeeping practices, but also how to create a sustainable business. And that has a lot to do with the market-facing side. So how to market your product, how to package it, how to use this message of, typically like in the Pacific, it's been known as this tyranny of distance. They've been so far from the market, the big consumer markets, that it's created a problem for them. But now we're saying, well, use this as a positive. That's when the world wants safe food, they want good food, they want clean food, they want organic food. These are things that this distance marketed right can create demand. Yeah. So that's getting touch on the trading side already. How making it sustainable and a business out of it makes it people take an active interest in protecting the bee rather than just letting things happen by chance. This is one of our containers. We typically send a container of 40 drums at a time down. You can see we pack it, we put it into the drums like that, food safe drums, and then it comes down to New Zealand and we put it into these bottles. And you can see from the bottles how we've made them quite unique. And this is part of our message to the region is to package it as very much as a high-end product. And it's a beautiful tasting honey. I mean, I would say that, wouldn't I? But it is. And it's more New Zealand honeys are a bit more floral, sugary, but this is more of a malty caramel flavor. So the chefs love it, and we're getting a really good reports back from it. We've adopted the certified organic standard. This is possible relatively easily in Niue because there's not an industrial agricultural sort of, there's no big farms using pesticides. It's mainly just family bush gardens. And so there's no pesticides in the environment, which makes it very easy. Well, not easy, you still got to go through the whole process of auditing, but it's something that we're trying to promote in the region as well. So these are some of the partners. Now, it was always really too hard for just myself and Andrew Corey, who's the beekeeper founder. And thankfully, we've managed to, after, sound like we're shouting to the wind at times, we managed to get the ears of some of the regional partners who've been able to magnify the voice. And certainly, it's very important, this bee stock, this Italian bee stock and in the region, we don't want to lose it. As I said, the other islands have already got diseases coming through. Really not through neglect, and we're trying to educate that let's just do this together as a region and make sure that we keep the biosecurity up and all work together. And so thankfully we've had these regional organizations, a couple international ones out of Europe the WTO, as I said, have been funding this through the STDF have been funding the regional survey, and they funded the just before COVID the feasibility study for Niue to become a bee sanctuary. So that's where we're at. And thank you all. And that's a little bit of Niue. And I don't know what the weather's like up in your part of the world, but if that makes you want to come for a swim, come to Niue. And if you do come to Niue, come out and see us on the bees. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. Currently in the UK, it's a bit cloudy, so I'd definitely rather be there right now. So again, I've just got a few questions for you before we open it up to everyone. So you mentioned that the conservation side of it was sort of what interested you to begin with, but
Absolutely.
I was wondering how you actually began getting involved with pollinators as well. How did it all start?
Yeah, it was, I didn't plan it. It was, I kind of fell into it. It was a funny old thing. And so I knew the beekeeper. I'm a development economist by trade, and I was working in NIUE in '99 when Andrew Corey came up to the island. And we were standing on the plane ready to board in Tonga on the tarmac, and some guy cracked a joke behind me, and that was him, and we became good friends anyway. And so he always knew that he was a beekeeper by trade, so he always knew that the bees were special, and so he was wanting to preserve them. His business partner at the time was one of the first kiwifruit orchard, organic kiwifruit orchardists in New Zealand, and so he was Tim Oliver, and he was very keen on having an organic certified honey. And so that was his driver and his main motivation. And about 10 years ago, I was doing some work. I was working for an NGO, World Vision, and I was doing kind of an innovation role, looking at Polynesia, looking at social enterprise work. And so I started talking with Andy about potentially doing, this bee sanctuary, and we started the work going. And then I left World Vision and went on to do other things. And then Andy contacted me and said, hey, can I come on board and help him out? And so I kind of said, yeah, I'll do it. I did it a day a week, volunteer, then 2 days a week. And then before I knew it, I was full time. And so that was 10 years ago. So it sort of happened. If you'd asked me, 10 years ago, could I have seen myself doing this sort of thing? I would say no, but it's one of those things that once you understand the issues, you think, my goodness, it's, if I don't do it, sometimes things just cross cross your path, and you have to kind of just do it, and it's been a bit of a sacrifice. I left a corporate job and wage to work effectively in a startup, with all the insecurities. But I know that that this is a calling, I guess, to protect and save this bee for the region, for Niue, for the region, and maybe the world, in time. And so it just sort of happened, yeah.
I bet you're glad that 10 years later you are in this position and you're able to do all this work for the bees and help them. And so you touched on it a little bit as well. So with Rachel, she mentioned about sort of how the conservation of the pollinators can help preserve biodiversity in general. I feel like yours can do that as well, but it also has a lot of socio-economic impacts. Do you want to expand a bit upon that?
Yeah, it does. And so firstly, it's that preservation of the honeybee, in a secure place that's sufficiently isolated and safe. So that's number one. But you're right, it also has many spillovers. And for the Pacific Islands, where there's limited land resource, you need maximum productivity and food security. It's an important resource to ensure it gets to other islands, and it provides an opportunity for plant pollination, and that allows them to increase their crops and their food security and an economic driver. So, and then the beekeepers will get a livelihood from it. In years gone by, it's been hard, the tyranny of distance, but these days there are markets for unique honeys that are clean and certified organic, certainly in offshore markets in Europe and the States and in Asia. And so there's a market there for them to create livelihoods in these regions, which they don't necessarily have the same number of opportunities that we have in our parts of the world. So it's very important. And then again, as you said, very important for the environment, because these bees are pollinating forests and native bush, and in this world of rising sea levels, soil retention and native forest regeneration is important. And so, that's got that very important spillover in that space as well.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much for that. I'm just going to open up the questions to everyone now. I see that we've got a few in the chat already. So Charity has asked, how can international collaborations and partnerships address cross-border pollination challenges and food insecurity? So either one of you can answer, both of you can answer.
I'm going to read that.
It's a very big question, really.
It is a big question.
Yeah, I was just trying to find it to read it out again. How can international collaborations and partnerships address cross-border pollination challenges?
Well, maybe I could just say a few words, because we kind of started that in the Pacific. I mean, even though our borders aren't so close, there's hundreds of miles of ocean between our borders, but we've really found that in order to make this happen, we've got to work collaboratively, and that's why as I said before, I'm so thankful that that it's not just Andy and I, that there's others now, regional agencies like the South Pacific SPC, Foreign Secretariat, Pharma, all these regional agencies now that have come on board, and they're picking up this project at a regional level. And Andy and I could never have done it. We don't have the resources, we don't have the time to do it, but with others on board, and they can also take best practice and introduce it into the policy environment. So for when different Pacific Island countries start to develop their agricultural plans, they can actually include apiculture. Now if it's not in your plans, your national plans, it's not going anywhere. But if it's in there and it's a priority, then you can start attracting funding for it, whether it's bilateral or different donors, or whether that's however. So absolutely, we could not do what we're doing without this collaboration and sharing resources across the Pacific like we are. So I hope that maybe that answers some of it.
Yeah.
I think maybe sharing lessons learned as well. So,
Absolutely.
like we're doing with beelines in Britain, then buzzlines in Europe. But, sharing shared messages, which were important in terms of reducing chemical usage, creating habitat, connecting up habitat, putting together case studies of what's worked for you and sharing that with other countries. So, quite often say, oh, look what they're doing, they've done this.
Yeah.
They can do it, it works, we can do it as well. So putting together those case studies that motivate other people to try the same thing.
Yeah, okay, thank you for that. So we got another one. This is for Richard. If you give the honey for free to the people on Niue Island, how do you make up for the costs?
Well, there's only 1,500 people on the island, so it's not like it's massive, and it's not for commercial use. It's just for the for the kitchen. So it's fair use type of that you want to put it in a contractual term. So yeah, and it's just a cost of business for us, and we want to give back to the Niue community. Part of the Pacific Bee Foundation that we've started means that we will give a profit share back to the foundation, and then we've got a committee a Niue committee to select projects on the island to support. So it's very much in our heart to do that. But we do sell, like you saw that bottle on my presentation, that gets sold in New Zealand. It's doing very well. It's been in the market a couple of years. It's about to go to Australia next month, and then the US, and then the UK. So that's being sold. It's a for-profit social enterprise, if you can imagine. We're doing it to generate funds, but we also want to make sure that we are sharing that with Niue.
Thank you for that.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course. Go ahead.
Yeah, hopefully it's not a little bit controversial, but to Richard about the island. How long have you had honeybees on the island?
From the 1960s.
1960s.
Early 60s.
What I was just wondering is if you have done any work looking at the native pollinators and just ensuring that the honeybees aren't competing with the native pollinators, because in some places that can be an issue. Obviously, more in the city. In cities, you have to be careful about not having too many hives. But have you looked at all at the native pollinators and whether there is any competition between them?
No, well, we haven't been there that long. Like they were there a good 30, 40 years before us, you know, and so we haven't. There's been a couple studies that have been started, but they're more to do looking at the flora and looking at. There hasn't been a lot of research done in Niue around, you know, what's their floral fauna, and part of what we want to do is kind of sponsor that coming out of this regional survey stuff is start to look into that.
Yeah.
Look into what, you know, that's a bit of the environment, the background environmental stuff. Yeah, but in general, there's I don't think it's the same. It's not the same amount of other species pollinators around. There's some moths, some native moths. It's not a native bee. There's some wasps or hornets.
Yeah, I'm sure there will be bees. There will be bees.
Yeah.
It'd be interesting research for you to get involved in.
I haven't seen any. Might be some solitary bees. Yeah.
Yeah, you get a lot that live in the canopy of the forest. They're still finding new species that live in forest.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's articles in the Philippines, they've discovered new species just recently. So
pretty cool.
Thank you for that. I see Frank's got his hand up. Frank, do you want to unmute and ask a question?
All right.
Oh, Frank, we can't quite hear you at the moment.
Thank you so much, Emil. I'd like to
Frank, do you want to type it in the chat and we'll try and answer it through that?
Richard.
you're breaking up. If type the question in the chat, we can't hear you.
Frank, if you turn off your video as well, it might work a bit better.
Is that since we are in a world of business and Mr. Richards, okay. Richard.
Maybe just
Frank, if you can type it in the chat, then we'll be able to answer that question for you. While we're waiting for Frank, we do have another question in the chat. So Millicent says, in the face of climate change and habitat loss, how can we support bee populations to regenerate and, oh, here it is, and thrive when they lack sufficient plants for nectar?
I think by creating and managing habitats well. So even if you just have a small area, you know, on a windowsill, putting in some plants that pollinators can visit. If you have grass areas, letting them grow longer, so even the small plants can flower, and thinking about their nesting habitat as well. Getting involved at wildlife sites to help with the management. So it's really about habitat, more habitat, better habitat, more flowery habitat that's connected up. Trying to discourage people from using chemicals. You don't need to spray herbicide everywhere to kill things. You can strim if you've got a few thistles around a bench. So reducing the use of chemicals, putting in more habitat. And trying to put in, if you're in a hot part of the world, then, you know, put in plants that can grow without a lot of water. You don't want to be irrigating a lot and wasting water either, do you? So
so just sort of tailoring it to the area that you're in and just sort of providing more plants for pollinators to use.
That's it.
Yeah, thank you for that. So we're just waiting for Frank's message. Wait. Oh yes, so we've got a question from Mohammed a bit further up in the chat. I see, Rachel, you've touched on it briefly, but so Mohammed has said, Please tell me how I can use the Buglife line of activities and pollinators can help my students achieve the life skill requirements that some universities set for admission. Do you think secondary school students can be involved?
Definitely, yeah. And secondary school students are just that bit more advanced. They can develop their own little projects. They can do an awareness campaign to share with other people what they've learned as well. So, I think a lot of those skills that you need for university is showing initiative and showing your own creativity to create a project and share messages. And they can do on the ground habitat work as well. They can approach local council and say, can we do something with this little bit of the park that's a bit scruffy? We could put a vegetable garden in, or a herb garden, or something beneficial to the community and pollinators. There's so much you can do.
Yeah, they're just able to have a bit more authority in what they choose to do about the situation.
I'm working with an eco group in a secondary school at the moment, and we're going to be creating some wildflowers areas, a small orchard, a herb garden, and I might get them to help at another site as well, at a school at a church where they want to do some habitat work.
Yeah. So we've got Frank's message. So Frank says, since we are in a world of business where we have limited and scarce resources, how are we able to satisfy customers? I don't know if you can see this message in the chat. So how can you deliver to the market? How can you ensure quality? How are you able to fulfill the market needs? And then he's also said an interesting question of, where do you see the project 5 years from now?
Yeah, so I mean, so yeah, we when we started the NIUE Honey journey, we pretty much had to create our own market. I mean, obviously there was a market for honey, but no one knew anything about Niue or NIUE Honey. Certainly not in New Zealand. And in fact, you can't bring any other honey into New Zealand because of the biosecurity rules. They're very strict. But NIUE Honey, because we don't have any diseases and we get regularly audited, that was fine. And so historically, we've been, I guess, bringing honey into New Zealand for about 10, 15 years, but it's all come in those drums like you saw the pictures of, bulk historically, and that's gone into as a food ingredient. So it's gone into certified organic breads or yogurts or things like that, where they wanted a certified organic input, honey input. And so the challenge for us to make our business sustainable, because even though it was still a certified organic product, so we got a little bit more for it than typical, it still was a commodity. We're in that commodity trade, and we wanted to break out of that and have our own branded product. That was from a, as you say, from a developing customers. But it gives us, a canvas to tell the story of the bee, tell the story of NIUE. And so that was very important to us from a market education. So the customer's buying it, and they're not only just loving the tastes and the texture and all these things, but they're also learning about the bees, and they're learning about NIUE in the Pacific. And so it's kind of got multi dimensions to it. So we launched it in New Zealand, and not only did we know there's a lot of Niueans in New Zealand who live here. There's say 1,500 Niueans in Niue, and there's probably about 30,000 Niueans in Australia and New Zealand. So there's people are well aware of NIUE. Yeah. So that's why we launched here. We also used a well-known chef, Peter Gordon, to endorse it, so that there was a level of, and because he's been to NIUE, he's been out in the bees, loved the project, loved the bee sanctuary, and so got involved with us. And so that also helped to tell the customer, give the customer a sense of assurance that this was a quality product, as well as having that certified organic stamp kind of lifts your honey out from a lot of the others. So a lot of honey calls itself organic, and it is organic, and it calls itself pure and all these things. But there's another level going up to certified, where you get residue tested, and they test for 600 substances, and it's just so it's another level, and that we were very committed to doing that. And so that created a bit of a niche market for us. So we've aimed at, in New Zealand, we have a market where we have your typical your honeys that are multifloral local, and they're the cheaper ones that you know that sell at the supermarket. Then you'd have the high-end honeys, which is dominated by what they call a Manuka honey, which is a medicinal offering. So it's a honey that's got medicinal properties, additional medicinal properties. And so we're kind of in that middle slot between the very, very high-end medicinal and the lower end just general honeys. And we're a gourmet honey. And so that was how we branded ourselves. And so a lot of our effort, when you talk about what's, creating a market, and we had to kind of create it. And we spent a lot of time making sure that we packaged it properly, packaged it to look like different and high end. We made sure that when we went out to market, we placed it in retail outlets that, our brand benefited from their brand association. So go to the top store, think, wouldn't it be great to be in there? Example being is that we've Selfridges in the UK have asked to stock it. And so we're thinking, wow, great. That's a premium place to put it to help your brand get awareness and the brand association and grow it. So it's, even though what we're doing around the bee sanctuary side of things is, is obviously the driver, the heart of what we're doing, you still have to you have to do the marketing, you have to do the commercial elements to make it. And we can't, if we're going to pay for this bee sanctuary long term, we can't just go on, a project life cycle, 2 or 3 years of funding and get things going. We've got to be able to fund it by ourselves long term. So we need to be able to, and because we've only got a finite, product, we've only got a small island, we'll only have so much honey. We've got to, we decided to aim for the higher end luxury market. So that's kind of, I hope that answers your question. We've got to we've got to put on our commercial hats. I mean, my heart's with the bee sank. That's why I got involved, and now I find myself dragged into to support that. I'm dragged into this commercial world, and I don't come from it. So it's a bit like I feel like I'm painting by numbers. I kind of know the mechanics of it, but it doesn't come naturally. But it has to be done. Because to make this regional bee sanctuary work in a regional context, we have to make these businesses, these apicultural livelihood businesses sustainable. And so part of that is going to have to be how to market and sell your product.
Yeah, so you sort of found this niche area and then you took time to build upon that and create this product. And Rachel, I wonder if you can answer the second part of that. So where do you see your project in the next 5 years?
Well, I think, we're going to continue to do much of the same, but I'm hoping to see a lot more of bee lines filled, because there's a lot of work going on the ground that people haven't put onto the bee lines map yet. And every year we're doing more projects as well. So we want to see more of bee lines filled, more people aware of it, more people just doing things in their gardens, at their schools, but also farmers and landowners at larger scales as well. And also, we've been trying to feed into how local authorities manage their green spaces. So increasingly seeing more councils with long flowery areas along grass verges and on village greens and in parks and things as well.
Yeah, so just sort of creating more awareness and then seeing that manifest itself in real life. Yeah. And then we've got one more question. So this is for both of you. Do you work with volunteers or interns in your organisations?
Yes, we do. We do both, really. So a lot of our work is project based. So when we have a project in a particular part of the country, then we often work either with existing volunteer groups or we put out call outs. So yeah, in conservation, we depend a huge amount on, the energy and enthusiasm and skills from volunteers. And we do take on interns as well. Some of our projects, when we can, we'll cost in an intern. One of our interns is now just about to take over one of the projects. Which is great. So it is a really good sort of career development strategy as well. So
yeah, wonderful.
Yeah.
And Richard, are you able to answer that one as well?
Yeah, we hope to in time. We've just really come back to the island. The island was in hard lockdown during COVID years, so we've come back and we've just spent the last year tidying things up. And but we often get approaches, from students and other beekeepers who want to come up and do some work. And so we hope to be able to do that in the future. It won't probably be this year, but next year, because that entails, we have to have the infrastructure for it. You have to have some place for people to stay, and we're not quite there yet.
Yeah, but hopefully in the future that will be something
absolutely.
to
Yeah, but we're always open for visits and taking people out on the bees for the day. You can come out for the day, and we'll certainly put you to work if you want to come out for a day.
Yeah. Okay. So with that, we're going to finish there. We've just gone a bit beyond the time, but that's fine. We was having lots of questions. So I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for joining, and thank you to our speakers, Rachel and Richard. Thank you for joining us today. I've put on a few links on this slide. So we've got Trust for Sustainable Living website, but I've also put on the Buglife website and the Niue Honey website if you want to get some more information. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us all today. It's been really interesting. I've really enjoyed all of those questions, and it's been really great to learn some more about pollinators.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everybody.